I'm writing this because I need to get it out somewhere. And honestly, I don't know who else to tell. My name is Emma, I'm 24 years old, and up until 6 months ago, I thought I knew exactly who my family was and where I stood with them. I was wrong about almost everything. I grew up in what most people would call a tight-knit family. Sunday dinners at my grandmother's house were mandatory. Holidays were huge productions with aunts, uncles, and cousins filling every corner of the house. And family loyalty was preached like gospel. My parents, my younger brother Tyler, and I lived just 10 minutes from my grandmother's house, which meant we saw extended family constantly. My cousin Natalie was born just 3 months after me, and because of that, everyone always treated us like twins. We went to the same schools, wore matching outfits as kids, and were constantly compared to each other. Natalie was always the prettier one, the more outgoing one, the one who could light up a room just by walking into it. I was the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who got good grades and never caused problems. Growing up, I didn't mind the comparisons too much. Natalie and I were close despite our differences. We shared secrets, defended each other against mean girls at school, and spent countless sleepovers talking about our dreams for the future. She wanted to be an actress or a model, something glamorous where everyone would notice her. I wanted to be a veterinarian, working with animals and living a quieter life. Our family dynamic shifted when we hit high school. Natalie started dating constantly, always had a boyfriend or 3 guys pursuing her, while I focused on my studies and my part-time job at a local animal clinic. The family started making jokes about how Natalie would definitely get married first, how she'd probably have the big wedding we'd all remember forever, while I'd probably just elope or have something small and practical. I laughed along with these jokes, but they stung more than I wanted to admit. It felt like my family had already decided who we were supposed to be, and nothing I did would change their perception. Natalie was the star, and I was the supporting character in her story. After high school, things got even more complicated. Natalie went to community college for about a semester before dropping out, saying she wanted to focus on modeling and building her social media presence. My parents and grandmother thought it was wonderful that she was following her dreams. Meanwhile, I went to State University on a partial scholarship, working 2 jobs to cover what financial aid didn't, and my family's response was basically that I was doing what I was supposed to do. During my junior year of college, I met Daniel. He was a year ahead of me studying business, and we met in the library during finals week. He was smart, funny, and had this calm energy that balanced out my constant anxiety about grades and work and money. We started dating, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had something that was just mine, something special that had nothing to do with family expectations or comparisons to Natalie. I waited 3 months before introducing Daniel to my family. I wanted to be sure about us before bringing him into the chaos of Sunday dinners and family judgment. When I finally brought him home, everyone was pleasant enough. My mom commented that he seemed nice, my dad asked him about his career plans, and my grandmother said he had a good handshake, which was apparently important to her. But it was Natalie's reaction that I remember most clearly. She was unusually quiet during that dinner, watching Daniel with an expression I couldn't quite read. After dinner, she pulled me aside and asked if I was really serious about him. When I said yes, she just nodded and said she was happy for me, but something in her voice felt off. Over the next several months, Daniel became a regular fixture at family events. He got along well with everyone, especially my parents, who appreciated that he was ambitious and respectful. He'd help my dad with projects around the house, talk business with my uncles, and charm my grandmother by asking about her recipes. I was falling deeply in love with him, and I could see a real future together. Then things started getting weird with Natalie. She began showing up at events where Daniel would be, dressed more carefully than usual, laughing louder at his jokes, finding reasons to sit near him or ask him questions. At first, I thought I was being paranoid or jealous for no reason. Natalie was naturally flirtatious with everyone, that was just her personality.
But my best friend from college, Maya, who came to a few family gatherings, noticed it too. She pulled me aside one day and asked if I had noticed how Natalie acted around Daniel. When I admitted I had, she told me I needed to talk to Natalie about boundaries because the behavior was inappropriate. I tried to bring it up with Natalie one afternoon when we were alone. I kept my tone light, joking about how she seemed to really like Daniel and maybe she should find her own boyfriend instead of monopolizing mine at family events. She laughed it off, saying I was being ridiculous and insecure, that she was just being friendly and trying to make my boyfriend feel welcome in the family. She turned it around on me, suggesting that maybe I was the one with trust issues. I dropped it, feeling stupid for bringing it up. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just insecure because I'd always been compared to her, and now I finally had something good and was afraid of losing it. Everything came crashing down on a random Tuesday afternoon in April. I had finished my classes early and decided to surprise Daniel at his apartment. We'd been dating for almost a year at that point, and I thought maybe we could grab an early dinner or just spend some time together before I had to go to my evening shift at the animal clinic. I used the key he'd given me months earlier and let myself in, calling out his name as I walked through the apartment. The living room was empty, but I heard voices coming from his bedroom. Female laughter mixed with his voice. My stomach dropped, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe his sister was visiting or a classmate working on a project. I opened the bedroom door and found Natalie sitting on Daniel's bed, wearing one of his t-shirts and nothing else, her clothes scattered on the floor. Daniel was standing by the window in just his jeans, and they both froze when they saw me. The next few moments are burned into my memory in vivid, painful detail. Natalie's shocked expression that quickly morphed into something that almost looked like satisfaction. Daniel's face going pale, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to explain but couldn't find words. The way my hands started shaking so badly I dropped my keys. I didn't scream or cry or make a scene like you see in movies. I just stood there, completely numb, trying to process what I was seeing. Finally, I managed to ask how long this had been going on. Daniel started to speak, but Natalie cut him off. She told me it started about 2 months after I introduced them. She said they'd tried to fight the connection, but they couldn't help themselves, that what they had was real and intense and something I wouldn't understand. She actually said that I wouldn't understand real passion because I was too boring and practical. Daniel finally found his voice and tried to apologize, saying he never meant to hurt me, that things just happened, that he cared about me, but what he felt for Natalie was different. He said it like that was supposed to make it better, like explaining his feelings would somehow justify the betrayal. I left, without saying another word. I drove to Maya's apartment and completely fell apart. I cried for hours, the kind of ugly sobbing where you can't breathe and your whole body hurts. Maya held me and let me destroy a box of tissues and told me that both Daniel and Natalie were terrible people who didn't deserve me. The next few days were a blur. I blocked Daniel's number after he sent dozens of texts trying to explain and apologize. I couldn't bring myself to block Natalie yet, some part of me still hoping she'd come to her senses and realize what she'd done. Instead, she sent me a long message saying she hoped I could understand and eventually forgive them, that she never meant for this to happen, but love doesn't follow rules. What happened next was somehow worse than the betrayal itself. I decided I needed to tell my family what had happened. I couldn't keep showing up to Sunday dinners and pretending everything was fine, and I needed support from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I went to my parents' house on a Saturday morning and told them everything. I explained how I'd found Natalie and Daniel together, how long it had been going on, how betrayed and hurt I felt. I expected them to be outraged on my behalf, to immediately call Natalie's parents, to rally around me with support and anger at what had been done to me. Instead, my mother's first response was to ask if I was absolutely sure about what I'd seen. When I confirmed that yes, I was completely sure, she asked if maybe there was some kind of misunderstanding. My father sat there silently, looking uncomfortable, before finally saying that these things happen and maybe Daniel and Natalie really did just fall in love and nobody meant to hurt anyone. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I asked them point blank if they were seriously suggesting I should just accept this and move on. My mother said that Natalie was family, that we'd been like sisters our whole lives, and that she hoped I wouldn't let a boy come between us. She actually called Daniel, the man I'd been planning a future with, just a boy, like our relationship hadn't mattered at all. My father added that I should think carefully about how I handled this because I didn't want to tear the family apart over relationship drama. He said families have to stick together through difficulties, and this was just one of those difficult situations we'd all have to navigate carefully. I left their house feeling even more destroyed than when I'd arrived. Not only had I lost my boyfriend and my cousin, but apparently my own parents weren't going to support me either. They were already choosing Natalie, already minimizing what had happened to protect family harmony. That Sunday, I didn't go to dinner at my grandmother's house. I called and said I was sick, which wasn't entirely a lie, since I'd barely eaten or slept in days and felt physically ill from the stress. My mother called later that evening and told me that Natalie and Daniel had shown up to dinner together, that they'd announced they were officially a couple, and that the family was trying to be supportive. I asked if anyone had mentioned what they'd done to me, if anyone had stood up for me or questioned how this relationship started. My mother said that Natalie had explained that things just happened naturally, that nobody intended to hurt me, and that she hoped I'd be mature enough to accept the situation eventually. The fact that my mother was relaying this to me, expecting me to just take it, was devastating. Over the next few weeks, I learned through my brother Tyler that the family narrative had been completely rewritten. According to Natalie's version of events, she and Daniel had met at family gatherings and developed a connection, and they'd both tried to resist it out of respect for me, but eventually their feelings became too strong to deny. She painted it as some kind of tragic romance where they were the victims, tortured by their love for each other and guilt about hurting me. What she conveniently left out was that they'd been sneaking around behind my back for months, that Daniel was still my boyfriend when their affair started, and that she'd actively pursued a relationship with someone I knew I loved. But the family ate up her version of events, probably because it was easier than acknowledging that their golden girl had done something truly horrible. I stopped going to family dinners entirely. My mother would call every week asking when I was going to come back, saying that my absence was making things awkward, that I was being stubborn and needed to learn to forgive. She never once acknowledged my pain or validated my feelings. It was all about how my reaction to being betrayed was inconveniencing everyone else. My grandmother called and gave me a speech about how family is forever, but boyfriends come and go, that I was young and would find someone else, but I only had one cousin, Natalie, and I shouldn't throw that relationship away. When I tried to explain that Natalie was the one who destroyed our relationship, my grandmother just sighed and said that holding grudges would only hurt me in the long run. The only person in my family who seemed to understand was Tyler. He was only 19 at the time, still living at home and going to community college, but he called me regularly to check in on me. He admitted that he thought what Natalie and Daniel did was messed up, but he felt pressured to stay neutral because Mom and Dad kept talking about how important it was to keep the family together. I threw myself into finishing my senior year. I graduated with honors, got accepted to a veterinary program in a different state, and made plans to move away from all of this. Maya helped me pack, and I left town that August with barely a goodbye to my family. My parents seemed more relieved than sad that I was leaving, probably because my absence would make family gatherings less awkward. I built a new life in my new city. I focused on veterinary school, made new friends, and slowly started to heal from everything that had happened. I stayed in touch with Tyler, who would update me occasionally on family news. Natalie and Daniel got engaged 6 months after I left. I heard they were planning a big wedding for the following summer. My mother called to tell me about the engagement and asked if I'd be willing to come home for the wedding to show that there were no hard feelings. I told her absolutely not, that I had no interest in watching the two people who'd betrayed me celebrate their relationship. She said I was being petty and that this attitude would only isolate me from the family. I pointed out that the family had already isolated me when they took Natalie's side, but she just said I was being dramatic. 2 years passed. I was thriving in vet school, dating someone new who was kind and honest, and building a life I was proud of. I went home for Christmas that second year, mainly because Tyler begged me to come, and I missed him. The visit was awkward and tense. Natalie and Daniel were there, of course, married by then and acting like the perfect couple. Natalie tried to talk to me several times, saying she missed me and hoped we could rebuild our relationship. She never apologized, never acknowledged what she'd done, just acted like enough time had passed that we should be able to move on. I was polite but distant, and I left after 2 days instead of staying the full week I'd originally planned. Then everything changed last November. I got a call from Tyler, and he sounded strange, almost scared. He told me I needed to come home as soon as possible, that something had happened and I needed to be there. He wouldn't explain over the phone, just kept insisting I needed to come home immediately. I drove through the night, terrified that someone had died or been in an accident. When I arrived at my grandmother's house the next morning, I found my entire extended family already gathered. The atmosphere was tense and weird, everyone speaking in hushed voices and avoiding eye contact. My mother pulled me aside and told me that Natalie had made some very serious accusations against my Uncle Robert, my father's younger brother. She claimed that Robert had been inappropriate with her when she was younger, that he'd made advances and said things that made her uncomfortable. The family was in crisis mode, trying to figure out what to do with this information. I was stunned. Uncle Robert had always been one of my favorite relatives, funny and kind, someone who'd helped me with homework and taught me to ride a bike. The idea that he could have done something like that was horrifying. But I also knew Natalie, knew how she twisted things to suit her narrative, and something about the situation felt off. Over the next few hours, more details emerged. Natalie claimed these incidents had happened when she was 16 and 17 at various family gatherings. She said she hadn't told anyone before because she was scared and ashamed, but she'd been in therapy recently, and her therapist had helped her understand that she needed to speak her truth. Uncle Robert vehemently denied everything. He was devastated, crying and insisting he would never do anything like that he didn't understand why Natalie would make these accusations. His wife, my Aunt Carol, was standing by him, but I could see the doubt and fear in her eyes. The family was split. Some people immediately believed Natalie, saying we should always believe victims and that Robert's denials were exactly what an abuser would say. Others were skeptical, pointing out that Natalie had never mentioned anything like this before and questioning why she was bringing it up now, years later. I didn't know what to believe. On one hand, I knew accusations like this should be taken seriously. On the other hand, I knew Natalie's capacity for manipulation and lying. I decided to stay quiet and observe, trying to figure out what was really going on. Daniel was completely supportive of Natalie, standing beside her and glaring at anyone who questioned her story. My parents were clearly conflicted, but seemed to be leaning toward believing her. My grandmother looked like she'd aged 10 years overnight, torn between her son and her granddaughter. Then Tyler pulled me aside privately. He told me something that made my blood run cold. He'd overheard a conversation between Natalie and Daniel a few weeks earlier. They'd been arguing about money, about how Daniel's business was failing and they were drowning in debt. Natalie had apparently suggested that they could probably get financial help from the family if they played it right, if she gave them a reason to feel sorry for her and want to support her. Tyler wasn't sure if the accusations against Uncle Robert were part of that plan, but the timing was suspicious. He also mentioned that Natalie had recently been cut off from money by her parents after some poor financial decisions, and she'd been complaining about how unfair it was that other family members had more than she did. I started paying closer attention to Natalie's behavior. When she talked about the alleged abuse, her story kept shifting slightly. Details would change, timelines would move around, and she seemed more focused on the emotional reactions she was getting than on the actual content of what she was saying. She also kept bringing up how hard this was for her financially, how therapy was expensive, how she and Daniel were struggling and could really use support from the family during this difficult time. My grandmother, bless her heart, was writing checks. So were my parents and several aunts and uncles, all wanting to help Natalie through her trauma. I watched as thousands of dollars exchanged hands, all while Uncle Robert's life fell apart around him. He'd been asked to skip family gatherings until everything was sorted out, and I heard he'd been put on leave from his job while they investigated the allegations. I couldn't stay silent anymore. I went to my parents and told them about what Tyler had overheard, about this suspicious timing, about how Natalie's story kept changing. I begged them to at least consider the possibility that she might not be telling the truth. My mother was furious with me. She said I was victim-blaming, that I was letting my personal grudge against Natalie cloud my judgment, that I should be ashamed of not supporting a family member who'd been through something traumatic. My father just looked disappointed, saying I'd thought I'd grown past my pettiness about the Daniel situation, but apparently I was still holding on to resentment. Nobody would listen to me. Tyler was too young for anyone to take seriously, and I was dismissed as biased because of my history with Natalie. I felt helpless watching Uncle Robert's life fall apart while Natalie collected sympathy and money from everyone. Then, my Aunt Carol did something brilliant. She'd been doing her own quiet investigation, going through old family photos and calendars to verify when Uncle Robert had actually been at the gatherings where Natalie claimed incidents occurred. She found discrepancies, times when Robert had been out of town for work or when the gatherings Natalie described hadn't actually happened. Carol brought this information to my grandmother, who finally started asking harder questions. When confronted with these inconsistencies, Natalie got defensive and emotional, saying she was being attacked and nobody believed her. But she couldn't explain the timeline problems, couldn't account for why she'd placed incidents at events that hadn't occurred or when Robert hadn't been present. The whole thing started unraveling. Under pressure, Natalie's story kept changing more dramatically. She started contradicting herself in ways that became impossible to ignore. Finally, my grandmother had had enough. She called a family meeting and told Natalie she had one chance to come clean, to tell the truth, or she would be cut off from the family entirely. Natalie broke down and admitted she'd made everything up. She said she and Daniel were desperate, drowning in debt from Daniel's failed business ventures and her shopping habits. She thought if she created a crisis, the family would rally around her financially. She'd picked Uncle Robert because he was successful, and she thought the family might even encourage him to pay her off to make the accusations go away. The room erupted. People were shouting, crying, demanding explanations. Uncle Robert just sat there looking broken, even though he'd been vindicated. The damage to his reputation, to his relationship with the family, couldn't be undone just because Natalie admitted she'd lied. Daniel tried to defend Natalie, saying she'd been under a lot of stress and hadn't been thinking clearly, that they'd just been desperate and made a terrible mistake. But nobody wanted to hear it. The family had reached their limit. What Natalie didn't know was that my grandmother had been recording the conversation. She'd suspected Natalie might be lying and wanted proof if she confessed. She immediately called the police and reported the false accusations. She also contacted Uncle Robert's employer with the recording, helping to clear his name at work. My parents looked devastated. They'd given Natalie over $15,000, money they couldn't really afford to lose, based on her lies. Other family members had given money too, all of it gone to pay off Natalie and Daniel's credit card debts and car payments. The legal fallout was severe. Uncle Robert decided to press charges for defamation and the damage to his reputation. Other family members sued to get their money back. Natalie and Daniel's marriage started crumbling under the pressure. Daniel apparently blamed Natalie for coming up with the plan, and she blamed him for their financial situation that led to her desperation. But here's where my story takes an unexpected turn. During all of this chaos, my grandmother pulled me aside privately. She was in her early 80s by then, still sharp as a tack despite everything she'd been through. She told me she owed me an apology. She said she'd always known Natalie had a manipulative streak, had seen how she twisted situations to her advantage, but she'd chosen to overlook it because Natalie was charming and it was easier than confronting the problem. She said when Natalie took Daniel from me, she should have stood up for me instead of prioritizing family peace. She was sorry for failing me when I needed her most. My grandmother told me she'd recently updated her will. She'd always planned to split everything equally between all her grandchildren, but after seeing Natalie's true character fully revealed, she'd made changes. The house, which was worth a considerable amount since it was in a desirable neighborhood, would go to me. Her savings would be split between me, Tyler, and our other cousins who hadn't been involved in the drama, but Natalie was completely removed from the will. She asked me not to tell anyone yet, saying she'd inform the family when the time was right, but she wanted me to know that I was appreciated, that my character and integrity hadn't gone unnoticed, even if it had seemed that way for a while. I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt vindicated, but mostly I just felt sad that it had taken something this extreme for anyone to really see what Natalie was capable of. I thanked my grandmother and told her I loved her, and we sat together quietly for a while. The next few months were chaotic. Natalie and Daniel's marriage officially ended in divorce. Daniel apparently moved back to his home state, and last I heard, Natalie was living with her parents, who were barely speaking to her. She'd lost almost all her friends when word got out about what she'd done, and her social media, which she'd once maintained so carefully, sat abandoned. Uncle Robert was slowly rebuilding his life, though he told me privately that he'd never fully recover from having his character questioned like that, even though everyone now knew the truth. The family gatherings became smaller and more subdued, with a lot of people still processing their anger and hurt. My parents finally apologized to me. It took them months, but they eventually acknowledged that they'd failed me, that they'd chosen to believe Natalie over me because it was easier, and that they should have supported me from the beginning. My mother cried and said she'd been so focused on keeping peace that she'd sacrificed her own daughter's well-being. I accepted their apology, but I told them honestly that our relationship would never be what it was. The damage had been done, and while I could forgive, I couldn't forget how quickly they abandoned me when I needed them. We're working on rebuilding trusts, but it's slow and sometimes painful. Tyler has become my closest family member. He's still in school, but we talk almost every day now. He told me he learned a lot from watching everything that happened, particularly about standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable or unpopular. Last month, I graduated from veterinary school at the top of my class. My grandmother made the trip to see me walk across that stage, and having her there meant everything to me. My parents came too, and we had a nice dinner together afterward. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than I had expected. Then came Thanksgiving. My grandmother had announced she wanted the whole family together for the holiday, saying it might be one of her last chances to have everyone at her table. Given her age and some recent health scares, nobody felt like they could refuse. So I went. The gathering was awkward from the start. Natalie showed up late with her mother looking nothing like her former self. She'd gained weight, her hair was unstyled, and she wore baggy clothes that seemed designed to help her disappear. She wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. We were all sitting around the table trying to make small talk and pretend everything was normal when my grandmother stood up. She announced that she had something important to share with everyone. My stomach dropped, wondering if she was going to reveal the will changes right there. Instead, she pulled out an envelope. She explained that after everything that had happened, she'd insisted on something before she could fully move forward. She'd asked Natalie and Uncle Robert to both submit to DNA testing. She wanted definitive proof of family connections, wanted to remove any doubt or questions from anyone's mind. The room went completely silent. Nobody had expected this. Grandmother opened the envelope and read the results. Uncle Robert was confirmed as her son, which nobody had questioned. But then she read the next result. Natalie was not her biological granddaughter. The room exploded into chaos. Natalie's mother started crying, screaming that this had to be wrong, that there was some mistake. But my grandmother calmly explained that she'd already verified the results with the testing company. There was no mistake. Natalie sat frozen, her face completely white. My grandmother continued, explaining that she'd had her suspicions for years based on certain physical characteristics and family traits that didn't quite add up. but she'd never pursued it because it hadn't seemed important until Natalie's behavior had become so destructive that grandmother needed to know the truth about everything. What came out next was even more shocking. Natalie's mother finally admitted through her tears that she'd had an affair 30 years ago. Natalie's father, my Uncle James, wasn't her biological father. The man who was had been a coworker of Natalie's mother, someone who'd moved away before Natalie was born. Uncle James was sitting right there at the table. He looked like he'd been punched in the gut. He'd raised Natalie as his daughter for 25 years, never knowing the truth. The betrayal on his face was heartbreaking. My grandmother wasn't finished. She announced that given this new information, she'd made the decision to remove Natalie from her will entirely. She explained the other changes too, how I would inherit the house, how the money would be divided among the biological grandchildren. Natalie finally found her voice and started screaming. She said this was all my fault, that I'd somehow manipulated grandmother into turning against her. She accused me of being jealous of her my entire life and finally getting my revenge. She was hysterical, and her mother had to physically restrain her. I just sat there, completely overwhelmed. I hadn't known about the DNA test. My grandmother had done this entirely on her own. And while part of me felt vindicated, mostly I just felt sad for Uncle James, who just discovered his entire marriage and family had been built on a lie. The dinner ended in chaos. Natalie and her mother left, with Uncle James saying he needed time to process everything and couldn't even look at his wife. Other family members were divided between shock, anger, and confusion. After everyone else had gone, I stayed behind to help my grandmother clean up. She apologized for blindsiding me with the announcement, but she said she'd wanted everyone to hear it at the same time to prevent Natalie from spinning another narrative or manipulating the story. She also told me something that made everything click into place. She said she'd started suspecting the truth about Natalie's paternity years ago, but watching how Natalie treated me, how she'd stolen Daniel and then lied about Uncle Robert, had made grandmother wonder if perhaps Natalie's destructive behavior was partly because on some unconscious level, she knew she didn't fully belong, and she was acting out because of it. I don't know if that's true or if it's just grandmother trying to make sense of Natalie's actions, but it gave me a different perspective on everything that had happened. It's been 3 weeks since Thanksgiving. The family is still reeling. Uncle James has filed for divorce. Natalie has apparently moved out of state, according to Tyler. Several family members have reached out to apologize to me for how they treated me over the years, finally recognizing that Natalie had been manipulative all along and I'd been telling the truth. My parents have been different too. I think seeing how badly they'd misjudged everything, how they'd supported someone who wasn't even their biological niece over their own daughter, hit them hard. They've been making a real effort to rebuild our relationship, and I appreciate it, even though the trust is still fragile. Last week, my grandmother asked me to come over. She wanted to show me the house, to walk through it with me and talk about all the memories it held. We spent hours going through old photos, her telling me stories about my grandfather who passed before I was born, about raising her kids, about watching her grandchildren grow up. She told me she was at peace with her decision about the will. She said the house should go to someone who valued family and integrity, someone who'd proven they had strength and character even when tested. She said I'd been tested more than most people my age, and I'd come through it with my values intact. I told her about my new relationship, about the man I'd been seeing who treated me with respect and kindness. I told her about my plans to open my own veterinary practice in a few years. She listened and smiled and said she was proud of me for who I'd become. Looking back on everything that happened, I can see now that the worst betrayal wasn't just about Natalie and Daniel. It was about a family that chose to believe lies because they were comfortable, that prioritized appearance over truth, and that was willing to sacrifice one person to maintain false peace. But I also learned who really had my back. Tyler, who risked his own comfort to tell me the truth. My grandmother, who eventually chose justice over convenience. Even Uncle Robert, who reached out to thank me for believing in him when many didn't. The family I thought I had was largely an illusion, but in its destruction, I found the people who actually mattered, who actually loved me for who I was rather than who they wanted me to be. I'm not glad for what happened. The pain was real and the scars will always be there, but I'm grateful for what I learned about myself, about my strength, about my ability to build a life based on my own values rather than other people's expectations. Natalie sent me an email last week. It was long and rambling, full of justifications and explanations and what seemed like attempts at apology without actually apologizing. She said she hoped someday I could understand why she did what she did, that she'd been struggling with her identity and self-worth her whole life, and that she'd made mistakes, but so had everyone else. I read it once and then deleted it. I don't owe her forgiveness or understanding. I don't owe her anything at all. She made her choices and now she has to live with the consequences, just like I had to live with the consequences of her choices for years. My grandmother is talking about selling her house in the next year or two and moving into assisted living. She says she wants to do it while she can still make her own decisions, while she's still healthy enough to manage the transition. The house will officially become mine then, and I'm not sure what I'll do with it. Part of me wants to sell it and use the money to open my practice. Part of me wants to keep it, to preserve the good memories it holds. Tyler says I should rent it out for a few years while I decide, give myself time to figure out what feels right. I think that's probably good advice. I'm learning that I don't have to make all the decisions immediately, that it's okay to sit with uncertainty while I figure things out. That's something the old Emma, the one who was so desperate for family approval, would never have allowed herself to do. I'm also learning to set boundaries with my parents. They want things to go back to normal, to have weekly dinners and constant contact, but I'm not ready for that. I see them monthly, we talk on the phone every couple of weeks, and that's enough for now. They're disappointed, but they're trying to respect my limits. The other day, my mother asked if I thought I'd ever be able to fully forgive them. I told her honestly that I didn't know, that forgiveness was a process and I was still in the middle of it. She didn't like that answer, but she accepted it. As for Daniel, I heard through mutual friends that he's engaged again to someone new. I felt a small twinge when I heard, not because I still have feelings for him, but because I wondered if he'd learned anything from everything that happened. Probably not. People like Daniel and Natalie rarely do. I'm happy now, genuinely happy, in a way I wasn't sure I'd ever be again. My relationship is healthy and balanced, my career is on track, I have friends who actually support me and family members who've proven they value me. It's not the life I planned when I was younger, but it's better in many ways because it's built on truth rather than illusion. Sometimes I think about the girl I was at 21, introducing Daniel to my family and hoping they'd approve, so desperate to prove I was worthy of love and attention. I wish I could go back and tell her that she was already worthy, that she didn't need anyone's approval, that the people who mattered would see her value without her having to prove it. But maybe I needed to go through all of this to learn those lessons. Maybe there was no shortcut to understanding my own worth, to developing the strength to stand alone when necessary, to building a life based on my values rather than other people's expectations. My grandmother says that everything happens for a reason, though she admits she doesn't always know what that reason is. I'm not sure I believe that. I think terrible things happen sometimes, and the best we can do is survive them and try to become better people because of them, rather than bitter people because of them. I choose to believe I'm better for all of this. Stronger, wiser, more careful about who I trust, but also more confident in my own judgment. I don't need my family to validate my worth anymore because I know my worth on my own. And honestly, that's the best revenge I could ever have against Natalie and everyone who doubted me. Not anger or bitterness, but building a genuinely good life and becoming someone I'm proud to be. So that's my story, Reddit. From golden child cousin stealing my boyfriend while the family chose her side, to DNA test results at Thanksgiving dinner revealing she wasn't even biologically related to us, to inheriting my grandmother's house and building a new life on my own terms. If you're going through something similar, if your family is choosing someone else over you, if you're being gaslit or manipulated or told you're the problem when you're actually the victim, I want you to know it gets better. Maybe not in the way you expect or hope, but it does get better. Stand your ground, trust yourself, build a life you're proud of regardless of who approves or disapproves. And remember that family is more than biology or obligation. It's about who shows up for you when things get hard, who believes in you when others don't, who values you for who you are. The family that betrayed me wasn't really my family at all, but the people who stood by me, who fought for me, who saw the truth when others chose blindness, they're my real family, and that's more than enough. What would you do if your family chose your cousin over you after her lies destroyed your relationship? Would you fight for vindication or just walk away? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, please subscribe for more real-life family drama and betrayal stories.